The problem with looking for the answer to acceptance on the level of the mind that is steeped in its duality is it reaches the same point. It reaches the point that Sarah pointed to, which is the outrageousness. So you understood that outrageousness, because as the invitation to acceptance, comes, and it does draw us, I'm not proposing acceptance because it's a good idea on paper, in theory, to be taught in schools, or it makes any rational, logical sense. I'm talking about acceptance because it seems to be the inevitable conclusion, in a way, to realizing one's true nature, or to realizing the nature of the world itself. The wheel that turns like this. And to find oneself in that place of realizing the world turns like this is to deeply accept suffering. Not because one's sanctioning it, as the ego likes to say, but actually because it is the wheel that turns. It is the nature of form. Form. We are born into suffering. We exacerbate it by identification with the ego self. But actually, suffering is inherent in manifestation, because we're born into finite forms that are inevitably going to reach the end of their form life and decay back into nothingness. That is the wheel of suffering, born into form, born into ignorance of form, and exiting at some point. So it's almost like the one that needs to be sacrificed is the one who's calling it outrageous. Because it cannot be argued with on that level. Because, I mean, I'm not a fool. If I look on the level of form out into the world, all I see is suffering. All I see is war. All I see is this endlessness. And I've seen that mirrored in my own mind as well. I've seen that suffering of the world, the warring of the world, the righteous one, the wrongous one, the ignorant one, yeah, the victim one, the aggressor one, the greedy one, the frightened one, the scared one, the anxious one. Everything that I've seen out in the world, I've also seen in the makeup of my own mind. There it is, mirrored. As you said yourself, it could be me. To a certain extent, I could be out there. I used to wage war on the world. Not with a gun, but with my being, with my personality, because I thought the world was terrible. And I was so filled with enmity from my parents' disaster of a marriage and stuff that I thought the only way was to defend myself and attack the world. And there I was in this rigid belief system, upholding those values, upholding those beliefs at all costs. So I'd built a self. It wasn't a very functionally great self. It was a mess. But still I'd defend it to my last. And anything that came along that said, well, maybe you could find a deeper acceptance of the way that you are and the way the world is, caused me a certain, well, not a certain, caused me to shriek in, you've got to be fucking kidding. And thus, and thus, and thus, and thus, and thus. That one, that very Kavi himself, the one who held up the idea that he knows how the world is supposed to be, had to be sacrificed. And it's not an easy job. It's not an easy job. And that's where the textures and the subtleties and the nuances of the inner experience need to be met within ourselves, because it can only be an authentic experience. It cannot be an imposed experience. It's no good arriving at a new belief It's only works if it reaches the tenderness. And so just before I hand back to you, it needs to reach the heart. That's where it needs to reach, because when it reaches the heart, when that juxtaposition of that's outrageous, yes, but we're going there anyway, opens up the heart, which has been fortressified in our lives. The open heart, the tender heart, the deepest heart is fortressified in this life. We don't value it. We value it in a transactional way, in relationship or blah, but we don't value it in the sense that when that inquiry falls into the depth of the heart, it breaks the heart wide open, because the heart says there is so much suffering, my suffering and the world's suffering. And the only answer really is yes, there is. And we're going deeper than that. But if it just stays in this perennial mind place, yeah, that you're the compassionate soul, or the compassionate, tender, more tender place within us arises and is somehow begins to be able to sit in the fire almost, or even allow itself to drown a bit in the ocean of human suffering without mitigating it. One does what one does when one does it. It's the only answer. One does what one does when one does it. If the neighbor's screaming and doing the thing, then you either have a choice. You're called to it or you're not called to it. And then there's somebody down the street who's beating their child at this moment. And then there's the whole of the warring that's going on out in the bigger world that you can't do anything about. Of course, you can take to the streets if you do what you do when you do it. But as a state of consciousness, as a state of being, one either accepts the way things are, or one argues relentlessly with the way things are. And this is not an easy place. It's a very tender, nuanced, subtle, broken-hearted place almost, without indulging, the idea of broken-heartedness.